Trump is probably a Savoy cabbage or something a bit more. He might even turn out to be a celeriac or a potato. But
he's hardy, but he has time. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Roger Griffin with me, and he's a professor emeritus from Oxford Brook, and we are going to be talking about fascism today. So, Roger, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
I know, wish could be on better circumstances and a better topic, but we are here, and that's good. So, what are we drinking?
Oh well, my wife always tells me that I don't drink enough water, and so do doctors and everything else. So I've foregone beer, and I've just got my Highland Spring Scottish water, pure as the water in Scotland.
Perfect. I will drink beer for us.
Which creates whiskey, but this is spring water without the ingredients that turn it into whiskey.
Oh,
whiskey
right.
comes from the Scottish for water of life. Uskabach means water of life. So
Who knew?
I'm halfway there.
Who knew? Well, I am drinking a beer for us. It's what I've been having the past couple ones. It's a Talea watermelon sour ale. Highly recommend.
Wow.
And cheers.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and background, and then the question I always love to ask, which is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Okay, well, I could answer the second part first, which is I'm just an academic. Now, academics have truths which are not necessarily the truths that other people come up with. There are emotional truths and subjective truths, and there are the truths of journalism and the truths of the artist. Academic truth is a particular type of truth because it's based on evidence and testing theories in principle. The trouble is there's an infinity of evidence and there's a multiplicity of theories. So when you get a whole load of different minds looking at the same problem in the human sciences, they will all come up with different interpretations. But the fact there's a proliferation of interpretations, first of all, means that none of them are completely right. So there's no absolute truth. But if they've done their work properly, like a professional academic, they will have eliminated various things such as myth, invention, fake facts, fake histories, and their theories will be presented with a certain caution, a lack of dogmatism, openness to other opinions, which distinguishes it from other sorts of truth because it's partial and provisional, and it relates to the original meaning of the word essay, which comes from the French for an attempt. It's just an attempt to make sense of a complicated thing. So the truth that I specialize in is that sort of partial, considered, evidence-based, hypothetical research into a complicated question. And all you can do as an academic is hope to end up less ignorant than you were in the first place.
I feel smarter already just having listened to that. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about your research about fascism? And you're one of the leading experts in it.
So though I only got a degree in French and German literature, I got a first, which is you're meant to be very proud of. I found myself teaching history of ideas or isms. So I became very good at isms. And then I had a head of department who fought fascism in Italy in the Second World War, an American called Robert Murray. But when he came out of the war, the US sent him to university. It happened to a lot of officers in Britain and America. And he started trying to study what the heck he'd been fighting, i.e. fascism, and he really couldn't make sense of it. So he wanted to run a course in his history department with me on it about what is history. And the trouble is, as I suddenly started studying this, I realized there are lots of different theories of fascism, but nobody had resolved them into some sort of consensus. In other words, no two authors agreed with each other, and some of them were pointing in very different directions. So because I could read French, German, and my wife was Italian, I started reading fascists. Now that sounds pretty sick, doesn't it? I found it very, I mean, some people say, oh, why do you study fascism? You must be, I've even had somebody say you must be a bit of a fascist. Well,
wild
I would
jump
draw an
there.
analogy. I draw an analogy with an oncologist, somebody who studies cancer. It doesn't want cancer and doesn't love cancer, but they want to understand. And having been to a concentration camp when I was 17, and it blew me away, and I couldn't understand how human beings could do that to each other, I had a sort of deep drive to try and make sense of how on earth did that happen. And I didn't find, when I started reading historians about the Third Reich and Auschwitz and everything, I didn't find any of the explanations possible. I mean, put crudely, it was there were all these middle-class people with lots of savings. And in 1928, the Americans had this Wall Street crash, and that crashed the economy. And suddenly they're all voting for Hitler. Well, there was a causal link there. I mean, we had a financial meltdown in the West in 2008-9, but you didn't get a mass movement of Nazism. So what is the link between the collapse of an economy and high unemployment and fanaticism about Hitler and swastikas? So I started realizing that as I read fascists, they knew what fascism was, and nobody had actually bothered to ask them. None of the books written by Marxists or non-Marxists actually tried to model what fascism was in terms of what fascists believed. In fact, a lot of experts said that fascism didn't have any beliefs. It was like a psychosis. It was like a mass epidemic of madness, and it's pointless looking for an ideology. Now, this is really weird, because if you look up a definition of something, another ism like feminism or communism or whatever, it's based on how a feminist or a communist defines what they are. But fascism, nobody was asking the fascists. So in my little research program, I started collecting fascists, which is a bit like being an entomologist collecting butterflies and pinning them to a and I started literally just building out, and it became a sort of mad hobby. But I saw emerging from all this reading I was doing a very clear idea of what was the common denominator, the basic idea shared by all these fascists. And that produced a theory of fascism, which I turned into a single definition, a single sentence definition, and then a whole book about it. In other words, I spent a whole chapter explaining the sentence. So the sentence isn't the beginning, it isn't the end of thinking, it's the beginning of thinking. So here's the sentence. Well, first of all, the background. What I discovered in so many writings by fascists, some of them actually had the decency to call themselves fascists. The Italian fascists, the British fascists, there are other groups calling them. Many of the movements didn't even use the word fascist, but nevertheless, they're grouped together in the collective imagination and memory. Because, for example, Nazism didn't call itself fascist, but it was obviously allied to fascism. It was part of the Axis. Mussolini and Hitler so there must have been something in. So what was this common denominator? Obviously Italian fascism or German fascism or British fascism or Romanian fascism. And there was American fascism, very small. The Ku Klux Klan was much bigger. What is the common denominator which allows a Romanian to feel that they have more in common with a British fascism than fellow Romanians? It all has to do with the idea of the nation. The nation, now this is not any old nation. This is a mystic, organic, sort of living organism, a nation that has always existed. It goes back to the roots of time, the mists of time. It's going on into the future. You are just a single individual unit of this thing called the nation. So this is a sort of mystic nation. And this mystic nation is in deep trouble. It is declining. It has got inner enemies. It's got outer enemies. It's being watered down by, and now you have a long menu. I mean, you have communism, materialism, homosexuality, feminism, and obviously liberals, humanists, people who think that everybody's equal, foreigners, and of course, in the case of Germany, Jews. They became very important in the fascist imagination in Italy later. But you have this long list of forces which are undermining this thing called the nation. Now, can the nation be saved? Well, here's the point. For fascists, the nation cannot be saved just within the democratic system. the democracy has to be superseded, it has to be destroyed and replaced by a system, a totalitarian system, an autocracy with a single party and a single leader who will make the country great again. Now, if that is a familiar phrase to an American, note the difference, because Trump is operating from within still just the American Constitution as it stands. Now, he may have pipe dreams of changing that, and he might even suggest it one day. But a fascist may get into power, as Mussolini and Hitler did differently and separately, in order to become head of state within the democratic system, but they immediately dissolved, or not immediately, but both of them dissolved democracy to create a fascist state. So fascism is a form of extreme nationalism, which is revolutionary. Now, Marxists hate me for saying that, but it's a revolutionary form of nationalism. And the core myth that drives it is a very particular myth, and it's a myth that takes thousands of different forms in history, and that's the myth of rebirth, the phoenix from the ashes, turning over a new leaf, dying to the old Adam and becoming the new man. This idea of renovation, regeneration, of creating a new person is absolutely fundamental to fascism. So fascism is the pursuit of national rebirth, but not within democracy. It has to be within a post-democratic state. And then if you then look at all the different people I was looking at in Romania, and there was even a minuscule example in Japan, because Japan retained its emperor. That's not fascist. That's still feudal. I mean, that's still it's not broken with the past. But to be a fascist, you have to despair of democracy, break with conservatives, and want to create this shiny new reborn nation. And to do that, especially if you're a Nazi type fascist, it's only one form of fascism, you ruthlessly root out all those forces in your country and outside your country which are threatening this mystic thing called the nation. So destroy communism, actually go into Russia and actually destroy communism, take all the Jews out of Europe, put homosexuals in concentration camps. This is absolutely consistent with the radical revolutionary. Look at any revolution, look at the French Revolution, look at the Russian Revolution. That violent phase is the cleansing phase, when you're getting rid of the elements which are poisoning your nation. And they use words like poison, etc.
What are the steps to starting from a democratic society to getting a fascist leader?
Well, first of all, you need something you can't create, which is a radical structural crisis. Now, we've had a financial crisis within the lifetime of anybody over 20 or 30 or whatever. But that radical, this is the weird bit of history that I'm interested in. Why did 2008-9 not destroy the capitalist democratic system? It didn't. People never even thought of. There was no mass movement saying, let's get rid of liberal capitalism and let's have communism, or let's have, there weren't Nazis who are waiting, and it's called accelerationism. They want to accelerate the self-destruction of the present system and replace it with another. There's a little Nazi subculture all the time in every Europeanized country, but they did not come out of the woodwork and have mass rallies. The system held. Now, what you need is a systemic crisis where at least a large chunk of the population, don't forget Nazism was only ever voted for by a third of the population at its height, but you need a big chunk of the electorate to want a radical alternative. And at that point, the longing for a radical solution almost single-handedly creates a leader. Now, here's an important point to notice. Charisma is often talked about as the property of an individual. We've even got this silly thing called Riz now, where somebody's got Riz. Well, the Riz is in the eye of the beholder. Literally, if you are longing for a savior figure, you will create a savior figure. Hitler in 1928 got 2.4% of the vote. And 3 years later, he got 37% of the vote. So had all the Germans changed? No. Had the Germans with their inner Nazi, because Germans are basically racist, etc., suddenly found? No. Germans are just like anybody else. But in 1928, as long as there was the prospect that the Weimar Republic could get better and stabilize and create full employment, etc., people emotionally stuck with the Weimar Republic, and Nazism remained marginalized. But when enough people despaired not just of their party, but of the entire system, a bit like in a storm when a freighter has a cargo ship, its cargo suddenly shifts from one side to the other. You get this mass shift of the population of electorates, a third of them, to seeing in Hitler this figure that he'd always believed he was, which is the savior of Germany. And this, at that point, Nazism takes off as a mass movement. It's paramilitary, it's full of uniforms, it is openly anti-Semitic, it's anti-communist, it wears uniforms to show that this is a new order being born. And the base swastika itself is a symbol of rebirth. They talked about the Sonnenrad, the sun wheel. It's an ancient symbol of the sun and Aryanness and everything else. So, first of all, it's not enough just to want a new order. You have to have this structural crisis which sparks an irrational, subjective sense of despair in the system. And as long as we've got all sorts of crises now. We've got ecological crises, and we've got wars in Russia, and we've got demographic crises, we've got migration crises. But what's interesting is the vast mass of the energy in the American population is not taking the form of mass fascism or mass communism. It's still being contained within the democratic system. So no matter how much fascists now want, until that crisis becomes say an asteroid hits us, and a lot of people think it's sort of finished everything, and there might be all sorts of things. But at the moment, and for the foreseeable future, fascism is a marginalized force, and it's been replaced in its toxic effect on liberal society by this thing called populism, which we can talk about if you like.
Interesting. So this brings me to my next question. A lot of what you're saying and talking about is obviously very reminiscent,
of course, of Trump.
Of Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the term fascist has been thrown around quite a bit.
Absolutely.
And people say we're in a new age of fascism.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that all these journalists and people, they should read my book. But you see, they're not looking for academic truth. This is why I distinguish that in the first place. If you're a Marxist, you have a totally different, quite coherent theory of fascism, which sees it as a product of the crisis of late capitalism. Late capitalism pretends to be liberal when it can, but when the chips are down and society is self-destructing, it throws off the mask of being nice and cuddly and becomes terroristic. And at that point, so Nazism is a terroristic form of capitalism. And the proof of that is that the German industry, German business carried on once it had been de-Semitized, once they got rid of all the Jews, entjudert in German, they carried on as before. Daimler-Benz stopped making cars and made bomber engines using the labor of Ravensbrück concentration camp. And there you have a sort of the essence of the Marxist theory. And it's very plausible. But I think it falls apart if you look at it from a non-Marxist point of view. So Marxists know what fascism is, and Trump fits the Marxist view of fascism because he is a hyper-capitalist. He is an example of the nastiness and illiberalism that comes out when a society is in crisis. And most Americans would now agree that the American dream has got pretty tarnished or it's completely evaporated. There are millions of disaffected, unemployed, poor Americans who are disoriented and they want the country to become great again. But the point is that longing for greatness, the MAGA myth, it does not suggest the destruction, which Nazism absolutely did. I mean, absolutely clearly from the 1920s, its mission was to destroy Weimar. It said Weimar democracy is not German. democracy is being imposed by the Allies. We need a new Germany, etc. Similarly with Italian fascism, Mussolini from the First World War onwards wants a new Italy, which will be great again. And their greatness again, well, they want to have the risorgimento, the unification process taken to its conclusion. But the great model is not the Aryan, but the Roman. Rome was great. The Catholic Church was great. The Renaissance was great. Michelangelo was great. And now look at us. We're just a tourist resort and full of foreigners and stuff like that. And now we're going to get great again. We're going to use this energy of our national genius, and we're going to create a new Italy. Not reform, not have a powerful party which will make it great again, but a new Italy. And even though Trump is really pushing the Democrat, you see, you've got to distinguish between democracy and liberal democracy. I would argue that no matter how illiberal he is, and he's certainly not a liberal Democrat, he still, till now, though he's pushing the envelope very hard, he's staying within the constitutional apparatus of democracy, of an American democracy. I mean, judges will decide whether what Musk is doing, closing down entire areas of American government, is constitutional or not. But the point is that there's no suggestion in my mind yet. And in fact, there's no basis. Do you know that in 1939, there were 500,000 uniformed paramilitary Nazis, they were called the SA, in Germany? Now, where is the military force in America? I mean, I see no evidence that Musk and Trump have secretly taken over the American army and the armed forces and are about to have some sort of great coup. Compared with the Nazi takeover and the 500,000 uniformed SA, the crowd on the 6th of January 2021 was pathetic. I mean, they would never get in a Nazi party because they would be seen as riffraff. They'd be seen as complete degenerates. So I don't see any evidence at all that Trump, even in his deepest, confused, megalomaniac mind, has any idea that he's going to actually destroy, like in the French Revolution or Lenin in the Russian Revolution, destroy American constitutional democracy and create a new order. I just don't see it. In fact, he seems to be quite happy, he and Musk, operating within the system now that he's got all his types into the key areas of power in America. So I think we should stop being obsessed with Trump's fascism and concentrate on what he's really doing, which is deliberalizing America, which is, I would argue, more dangerous than if he was a fascist. I mean, where are the fascists now? There are a lot of fantasy fascists on the web. There are a few people like dressing up in uniforms. There are a few terrorist attacks which are terrible and horrific for the victims. But compared with Nazism in 1939, I mean, this is nothing. But what we have got is over half the electorate in America voting for a guy who's very obviously, apart from all this thing about him being a felon, is absolutely dedicated to using presidential powers in the most extreme way to purge America of all sorts of things he doesn't agree with. But he doesn't need to be a Nazi to do that. He needs the levers of power. And until there's a good pushback from frightened Republicans and genuine liberal humanists and genuine Christians, not fanatical sort of anti-abortionist Christians, but Christians that care about what Jesus actually said about loving your neighbor. And until there's a pushback, a liberal pushback against Trump, maybe in 4 years' time, if he hasn't wrecked the whole country, then basically Trump will carry on as long as he can as a illiberal Democrat. He'll still be a Democrat.
For people that Roger is British, and so, it's important to, when you say Democrat, like believer in like democratic principles, right? In the US, one of our big parties is the Democrats. Yeah, well, and Trump really is like very much conservative. So just making sure people understand the difference.
Yeah, well, the other trouble is that the Americans use the word liberal differently from the British. So, I mean, this is a problem of language again. But so Democrat with a small d, committed to the principles of democracy. Now, let's remember that the Greeks had slaves and women couldn't vote, even if they weren't a slave. Let's remember that in the 18th century, American democracy, when it was getting going, had black slaves, and it was committing genocide against North American Indians, and women didn't have a look in there either. Democracy is not a liberal institution. The liberalization of America, of democracy, has taken decades, and it's a very incomplete process. Things like civil rights, things like the women's movement, the Me Too movement, Black Power movement, these are to be seen as attempts to re-liberalize American democracy. But democracy is not in itself a nice, friendly, loving, humanistic phenomenon. It is for small elites. I mean, historically, democracy is great for small, rich male elites. And it's taken a huge amount of work to actually build in the idea that A, all the country should have certain civic rights, and B, that the whole world should have those rights. And the high point of that optimism was 1948, the Declaration of of Universal Human Rights by the United Nations. The United Nations building, which Trump has very recently caused a great stir in by voting alongside Putin and North Korea, which is, I mean, quite honestly, there's no work for black comedians. I mean, I don't mean black comedians. I mean people who write black comedies and satires in America, because the reality is far, far more grotesque and perverse and comic than anything you could imagine.
So your argument is that Trump is trying to deliberalize democracy and create it for the white male elites, right? And get rid of all of the outsiders from the concept of a nation.
And female Trumpists, of whom there are a lot.
Right. People who only align with him and his values. But because he's still working within the democratic system, he is not a fascist.
He's not technically a fascist. One,
got it.
From an academic point of view, from the point of view of the type of expert on fascism which I represent. I mean, I was co-founder of a journal and an international association. There's still academics out there. One of them is Robert Paxton, and there are other people who don't agree with me. But I mean, there is quite a lot of consensus now that the most useful way of looking at fascism is a revolutionary form of nationalism. By the way, if you look me up, you'll see this keyword palingenetic. Palingenesis means rebirth. So the two-word definition I came up with is fascism is palingenetic ultranationalism. It's a bit like the Einstein formula. You know? Fascism equals rebirth myth plus extreme nationalism. And so the hallmark of this right-wing populism is that Germany for the Germans, Denmark for the Danes. So you want your democracy, but you want it for your kind, not for humankind.
Would you not argue he's doing that, though, with the beginning of that, with the expulsion of all these immigrants?
Sorry?
And especially like trans people and stuff like that?
Well, yeah. Well, that's a perfect example of going back to the illiberal democracy. I mean, Viktor Orban calls Hungary an illiberal democracy. A whole university called the Central European University had to move from Hungary to Vienna because it was founded by a Jew, Soros, and was based on the American system of university. And Viktor Orban expelled it from Hungary because it was un-Hungarian. Now, populists have this mystical idea of a ness, which is Americanness, Hungarianness. This essence, this ness, is a very, very dangerous mystification of what a nation is. And it means that you can't really, you might eventually end up as an Irish American or an Afro-American, etc. But it takes generations. And any trace of accent or obvious links back to your immigrant past has to have been completely, it's like a stain that has to be removed till you've been completely assimilated. So America is actually an immigrant nation, and it's full of the most incredible kaleidoscope of different ethnicities. But Trump never really addresses what it is to be an American, but he knows what it isn't an American, and that's a Mexican with a family starving, coming over from, to escape persecution or whatever. So you can define as not American. And don't forget, you had this wonderful invention in America of a committee of un-American activities. The idea of populists are obsessed with their conspiracy theories about people who aren't of their kind. I would also be probably dismissed as a liberal My whole way of speaking and entering this debate would be seen as sort of woke or sort of wishy-washy liberal or whatever. So basically, illiberal nationalism or what we call populism is a sort of rather paranoid form of patriotism, which creates artificial myths about who belongs and who doesn't belong. So, for example, the AfD in Germany wrote in its program in 2016 simply four words or whatever. Der Islam gehört nicht Deutschland. Islam does not belong to Germany. Boom. I mean, what? There are like 4 million Muslims in Germany, but they don't belong. Even if, like now, don't forget the Turks came into West Germany very soon after the Second World War. So that delegitimizes, dehumanizes the entire segments of the population. So populists love their kind, which is largely mythical because they actually hate each other normally in reality, and they hate, in inverted commas, the other. It's called othering in English, and that's what people
it's called
like
that here too. Yeah, the othering. Because Trump is still wanting to reform our democracy in a way that meets his favor, but the beginning of the pushback against constitutional principles and also against the rule of law, right? In many ways, one being trying to undermine judges' rulings and saying that they shouldn't be able to have this over executive power. How nearing fascism is that?
Oh yeah, well no, definitely the direction of travel. I totally get that.
Yeah.
Well, can I just say, by the way, the other definition of fascism, the other use of the word fascism is an expletive to delegitimize or cancel somebody. So you get kids saying their parents are bloody fascists because they've just turned off their video game console. I mean, that emotional cathartic use of the word fascism, I totally share about Trump. I mean, but it's called taxonomy. Taxonomy is where you categorize things. And the question we start with is there a coherent definition of fascism as a category of political behavior? And does Trump fit it? And my answer is, even if he's eroding, a fundamental American principle, which is beautifully articulated, and American theorists of democracy are wonderful, and the separation of powers, the peaceful transition of between administrations, the independence of the judiciary, freedom of speech, all these fantastic sacred, it's not religious sacred, but these are sacred truths of liberalism. Now, he definitely, in his extreme populism, because he demonizes people who are liberal, if you've got a liberal judge, in other words, if you have a liberal judge who applies liberalism to the question of abortion, he becomes an enemy. Trump has no respect for people who don't agree with him. So as long as he can man or woman the positions in government and in the arms of government, the security forces, foreign policy, etc., with his kind, because don't forget it's all about this myth of your kind and the others, he sees Democrats, democracy, Biden and the whole army of people and the millions of voters for democracy as really basically watering down, weakening this mystical nation, the Americanness of the Americans. And there are all sorts of weird little myths floating around about what a true American is. But to get back to, partly cowboy myths and a whole load of things and images, the Second World War and heroic creation of oil fields, etc. But about your question, yes, of course, from a liberal point of view, it is a catastrophe if you lose your separation of powers, if he's able to put Trumpians in all the key positions, if he puts people with no competence and no knowledge in charge of health, or people with paranoid. This is the president who believed that maybe it was worth experimenting with bleach as an anti-COVID. But he wants he doesn't care about their qualifications. In fact, there's a very deep mistrust in populists of experts. There's this whole idea that the ecological crisis is being dreamed up by a whole load of pseudo experts, and there's always been swings and roundabouts with the climate, etc. Now we're just going through another one. And basically, don't forget this myth that the planet belongs to us. This is our planet. According to Musk, even Mars belongs to us, but we haven't quite got round to it yet. And there are all these core myths which, like gender fluidity, is a sort of decadence born of the idea that anybody can sort of choose their own gender. So, and it's sort of unnatural. And there's all these weird core myths about naturalness and unnaturalness, Americanness and un-Americanness. And as long as judges are not interpreting Americanness and justice in his way, then they become part of the enemy. But that's still in his, I've said it's in the direction. I mean, if you look at Nazism, they actually retained all the Weimar judicial system that they could, and then created a para-judicial system for the concentration camps called the Volksgericht. And they actually created a parallel universe. And if you fell through the safety net of being a Nazi citizen, a German citizen, into that other sphere, you're in the hands of a totally different justice system. Now, I don't think that Trump, even in his wildest imagination, mind you, to try to get into the head of Trump is really, you need some
scary. You need a lot
more than beer. But nevertheless, I really would be very, very surprised. I mean, his megalomania might say he does solve, in his sense, i.e. destroy the Ukraine situation. Say he does somehow magically stop. Say all the countries he threatens with tariffs suddenly give in to Americans. So suddenly, supposing he and Musk reach this absolute egomaniacal high, he might, in his wildest deranged imagination, think that it would be really good for America if you had a permanent presidency by Trump, and that he then creates a dynasty and he creates a single party state. But that really, really is way out of kilter with where he's at present. At the moment, he's on a high. He had a first stab at presidents. He got chucked out. He learned his lesson, hitting the ground running and screeching off with leaving tire marks on the tarmac. He's got to hit a wall. I mean, adolescents in charge of Porsches nearly always have an accident. But at the moment, we're a month in, he's caused mayhem, he's caused chaos, he's thrown Europe into disarray, and he's on a high. But I don't think anything convinces me that this is the first stage in a takeover and destruction of democracy and the inauguration of a fascist state. He hasn't got he hasn't got the key elements. He hasn't got the subjective despair in the whole American system, which is the equivalent of Weimar in 1929. He hasn't got the army, he hasn't got the paramilitary forces, and he hasn't got the degree of corruption of government yet that you needed to do it. And I'm waiting for the pushback. I think there are millions of wonderful Americans who know this is sick and know this is wrong, and there will be a massive pushback by the very people who despises all the wokes and the creatives and the people who've actually read books and can actually have an attention span for more than 3 minutes, and all the people who've actually come to terms with the horrors of what's happening to the ecosystem and refugees, what happened in the concentration camps, the shame of Vietnam, etc., etc., etc. There's a wonderful constituency, but we in Europe and in America, we have to mentally arm ourselves, not physically. We have to realize that we can no longer take for granted the idea that liberalism is a majority ideology. It's got its backs to the wall, and there's some very, very nasty things out there trying to threaten us, and we have to rally and we have to take stands, and it's going to need a lot of courage. It won't be the courage you needed to survive the Second World War, but it will be lovely to see American liberals actually, instead of taking for granted their liberalism, mentally and organizationally fighting for it. We've had wonderful explosions of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, etc. I don't want some sort of violent anti-Trump movement, but a defense of remembering core liberal values. And Trump will be like we had a little experiment of this in England when this woman called Truss thought she could completely change the economy. She lasted a month, and she was compared to a lettuce. some witty journalist had a picture of a lettuce and said she will last less time
I remember that.
than a lettuce. Well, I think Trump is probably a Savoy cabbage or something a bit more. He might even turn out to be a celeriac or a potato. But
he's hardy, but he has time. He's going to get rotten eventually.
Well, I think the worm will turn, and worms of the world unite is my slogan. People like me.
Roger, this has been so insightful. Thank you so much for providing so much insight and providing it all.
People out there hating me, but there you are. You wanted half an hour of.
No, I love it. It's perfect.
What we do.
No, it's fantastic.
I wish well for any liberals out there who suddenly you have to strip the word of its misleading connotations in America and use it in a good old British way. I know you had an anti-colonial rebellion against us, but I'm talking about liberal humanism, this wonderful embrace of all human beings, irrespective of color, creed, height, or whatever, and linking directly to the planet and all human life, the biosphere. And though that concept is way beyond most hardcore Republicans, it is an absolutely wonderful scientific. It's the point where science and love meet. And that's where we have to aim our attention for the immediate future and long way into the future.
That's a wonderful note to end on. So thank you. And absolutely, this is the rallying call. And it's what bureaucracy has turned into. So Roger, thank you so much.
Thank you for your time and excuse it. It's called logorrhea. It's the unceasing flow of words. Logorrhea, like diarrhea of words.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And I hope you all recover well.
Thank you. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.